Aloha and welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute, where we like to say, let's work together. That's what Ehana Kako means. Let's work together to build a better economy, government, and society. Because think of the terrible alternative of not working together. Well, one of the ways in which we're finding that we're not all working together and we're not all on the same page is in the area of federal regulations that are made in Washington, D.C. that ultimately impact us in Hawaii and farmers and business people all across the nation. One law in particular today we're going to talk about is the Food Safety Modernization Act. That sounds ominous, but my expert today knows all about it. He's a national expert in the area of food law policy. He's an attorney, Baylen Linnekin. He's with us today from Washington, D.C., and I'd like to welcome him to the program now. Baylen, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, aloha, and thank you for wearing a shirt that looks very aloha-ish.
I'm doing my best here. I've never been to Hawaii, which is a deficit I hope to fix sometime soon, but this is my Cuban shirt from my time in Miami.
Right. Well, you and I know, because we're in public policy, that there's a difference between how we were educated in civics classes and what the real world is all about. I remember back in middle school, I learned that there are three branches of government, and one of them, the legislative, makes the laws. But isn't it the case that there is this ominous, vast bureaucracy of federal agencies that take those laws and make many, many more laws?
Yes, that is the rulemaking process, and it is one that we are victimized by in states across the country, and certainly federal rules that apply to everyone.
Now, I understand that if Congress passes a law, it goes through a process in which there are hearings, and presumably these laws are passed by the representatives of the people. But once those laws are passed, the agencies that administer those laws are given vast leeway in terms of what kinds of rules they can create to follow up on that. Is that correct?
It is true, and courts give them that leeway. It's largely a function of permissive courts and of poor lawmaking, poor drafting. Congress often realizes that there's some problem that they think needs to be dealt with, and so they what's known as delegate to an executive agency, which is overseen by the president and his appointees, say in the Food and Drug Administration or the USDA or the EPA or what have you. And so they go through a rulemaking process by which they propose rules that will implement the particular law that Congress passes. And the worse the law, the more vague. I guess sometimes specific laws are also awful. But in this case, the worse the law is, the more leeway the FDA has, for example, to sort of go in its own direction. You can bet that the agency is going to take advantage of that.
Now, I would imagine that there may be less accountability for laws that are created as administrative rules than actual legislative laws that are made in Washington, D.C., because our congresspersons have to go back to the voting polls and get reelected every 2 years or every 6 years. But administrators don't do that. Is there less accountability? Is there less recourse that people have when the IRS or the FDA come calling?
Oh, absolutely. They're essentially, this is everyone's complaint about bureaucrats. This is the classic example of bureaucrats who are, enacting rules in which the public has some input, and industry and activists and others have the same input, and your only recourse largely is either to complain to your congressman and ask them to change those rules, which rarely happens, or more likely, which does happen somewhat regularly, to sue. And courts, unfortunately, are very, very inclined to defer to agency rulemaking and feel that it's constitutional simply by the process in many cases. The fact that there was a rulemaking process, courts will often sort of rubber stamp that.
Well, at the Grassroot Institute, we are grateful for your consultation to us in an area of expertise that you've acquired over time, particularly as we fight the battle to help Hawaii's farmers survive against federal overregulation. I love the title of one of your books, which is Biting the Hands That Feed Us, How Fewer, Smarter Laws Would Make Our Food System More Sustainable. And in many ways, we're going to talk a bit about that. Just in general, How is the food system impacted, or how is farming impacted by federal regulations?
Well, this is only a 30-minute show, so I'll have to give you some highlights. But I mean, the FDA regulates roughly 80% of our food supply in the U.S., and so essentially any packaged foods, seafood, eggs in their shell, and some other food items, and chewing gum also, which the FDA defines as food. And the USDA regulates meats, pork, beef, chicken, and the remaining 20% of our food supply. And so if you add those two up, those agencies are regulating 100% of our food supply, and they're making those rules that we just discussed. And some of them are sensible. They say things like you can't defraud people,
Sure.
You can't intentionally sicken them, you can't adulterate their food. Those are rules that we should have, I think, and I'm glad that we do. And then other ones are completely inane and counterproductive and costly, and sort of feed into, and I'm sort of speaking as a non-economist, but one who's somewhat familiar with public choice theory, really in a way to sort of just build up the agency's budget and size and power, and not so much to help small farmers or pretty much any sort of growing entrepreneur.
Well, I'm really glad you made that distinction between regulations that are helpful and protect our food supply and regulations that are not helpful. And the problem is not that we have regulations. In fact, before we go on to the bad regulations, isn't it true that our government helps to ensure that we have the safest food system in the world, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, there have been times during our history when our food system was unsafe, and rules came into being that required inspections and testing, and some things that actually make sense, that require, for example, and we'll talk about this shortly, I think, but the FDA did not have the power to take off the market a food that it knew to be
Sure.
unhealthy, and so, and by that I mean, say, that contained bacteria that was going to kill someone. The FDA now has that power, and that's a smart power.
Yeah.
If the FDA can prevent actual death, imminent death, danger, then great. That's what the agency is there for.
So at the outset, it's important to clarify for our viewers that at the Grassroots Institute and other public policies like our own, and for yourself as well, we don't oppose the role of government. We, in fact, praise government when it works well, when it functions within its limited accountable scope and protects its people, and as a matter of national safety, protects our food system. In fact, we even commend the government for the good role that it has played. And so when the FDA or the United States Department of Agriculture are doing their job, there are good things. But as you and I have discussed, agencies overstep their boundary a bit. And there is a law that was recently passed called the FSMA, sometimes called the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, that addresses supposedly the situation of the lack of safety in our food supply. What is the FSMA, the FSMA, and essentially what is its aim?
It's a law that was passed in 2011, signed by President Obama about 5.5 years ago, I guess now. And it was intended to be, and its supporters have hailed it as the single most important update of our nation's food safety system in about 75 years. And it's true that our food safety system had not in many ways been updated, at least as pertains to FDA rules, in about 75 years. And fine, that sounds on its face very nice. Who's against modernization of food safety? But when you actually look at its impact and its cost, and the impact particularly that it would have on smaller and sustainable farmers, which is I devote a large section of my book to, it's a complete waste of time and money, and it's sustainable farmers around the country, small food entrepreneurs have railed against it and fear that it's going to put them out of business. There are two key provisions that apply to food that people eat, and there are other provisions that are sort of less important and germane to this discussion, one of which concerns pet food. But one concerns good manufacturing practices, which again sounds nice. But if you're a very, very small food entrepreneur and you're starting out, you have to, regardless of your size, you have to comply with these rules that really are intended to apply to, or should apply to, larger companies. The Nabiscos, as opposed to
Sure.
the guy down the street who, makes some muffins. And there's another provision which applies to produce, so fruits and vegetables. And it likewise contains steps that are really intended to apply to very large farms.
So one of the problems that you point out with the FSMA is that it has an inordinate negative impact upon small farmers, whereas large industrial farmers are capable of weathering the added regulations, even though they may not like them. The small farmers find it extremely costly. I want to come back to that point later on. I'd like later on for you to share some of the impact that the FSMA has on small farmers. But first, I think there's an underlying premise that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and so I want to go back to what you mentioned. You said that it was wasteful. And now I know you, Barry, you're not prone to metaphor, hyperbole and so forth. You're not just insulting the FSMA by calling it wasteful. You actually are making a statement that it's unnecessary. Are you suggesting that our food safety is not enhanced by the FSMA, or there's no need to have that law in order to enhance our food safety?
Well, I did cite, for example, the FDA's power to recall, foods that have known pathogens in them, which is one part of FSMA, which does make sense,
all right,
and which will make us and our food safer. And now, brushing that off the table, let's talk about the rest of FSMA. And the FDA's own estimates show that those two key rules that I talk about will each make our food system safer by approximately 1% to 2% each. So we're talking about, for something like $1 billion, something that is going to make us somewhere between 2% and 3% safer if it's implemented perfectly. And that's impossible because no law, no rule has ever been implemented perfectly. And so we're just talking about incredible costs on struggling small farmers for negligible, if any, increase in food safety in what you referred to earlier correctly is the safest food supply in the world.
So if the law works perfectly, if everything works out well with the law, it will only improve food safety by 2% to 3%, but we're not even sure it'll do that. When we come back from a short break, well, I'd like to ask you about the way this really works, and if we're really targeting what causes harm to our food system, or we're actually targeting farmers who really don't have a lot to do about the safety of the food system beyond what they're doing already. We'll be right back, Barry, in just a short break. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroots Institute. You're watching Ehana Kako every week here on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Don't go away, because I think you're going to find what Barry has to say very fascinating when we return.
Aloha, I'm Chantal Seville, the host of The Savvy Chick Show. You can watch the show every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Honolulu time and enjoy how to be inspired and empowered. If you're a woman or girl, everyone is welcome, but it's really dedicated to you. And we look forward to seeing you. You can also find us on thinktechhawaii.com. See you soon. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Justine Espiritu, and I am the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and we are live with you every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. And our show focuses on Hawaii's local food community. We feature not only the farmers that are producing our food, but we also feature the supporters and other folks involved in the community that are trying to promote local agriculture.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako. I'd like to say thanks to Jay Fidel and the entire crew here at Think Tech Hawaii. What a great organization, putting out maybe 30 to 35 hours of original content from Honolulu, Hawaii, that goes across the world and covers a range of issues from energy to agriculture to business to tourism, you name it. If it's an important issue, Think Tech Hawaii talks about it, and you can access the entire library of Think Tech Hawaii programs like ours, Ehana Kako, on the thinktechhawaii.com website. I'm Keli'i Akina, back with, and I have to correct this, Baylen Linnekin. He's a food law policy author and expert and attorney. I called him Barry a couple times before. Forgive me for that. Baylen, welcome back. Baylen, I've got a question for you. We were talking
Sure.
about the fact that even if this massively expensive and harmful law, the Food Safety Modernization Act, were administered perfectly, at best, we'd only get 2 to 3% improvement in food safety. But there's a deeper problem, and that is it's not targeting the causes of food or lack of safety in food, because, well, you tell us, are farmers responsible for the problems we have with food safety, or does it take place somewhere else?
Well, certainly farmers bear some responsibility, just like everyone else does. But when you look at the facts from places like the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA and the USDA, you find that, in fact, the FDA is sort of like the drunk person who's looking for their keys in the place where the light is shining, even though they dropped them somewhere else. And they're looking because they can see where the light is, even if that's not where their keys are. And so the problem is that, as I think we've discussed previously between us, 3 out of every 5 cases of foodborne illness, according to federal data, at 58%, are caused by essentially failure to wash your hands. And that is, from a restaurant cook or a server to your mom, to me, to you, anyone who's preparing food. If you fail to wash your hands before doing so, or throw some Purell on your hands, then you're likely to sicken yourself, your family, your customers. And that's 60% of the cases almost. Another 20% of the cases of foodborne illness are caused by foods that are not regulated by the FDA,
Right.
USDA food, meat, poultry, etc. So we're looking at 80% of foodborne illness cases, give or take a percentage point or two, are not caused by foods regulated by the FDA or are not subject to FDA regulation. So, someone works in a restaurant and they don't wash their hands and they touch a food that's regulated by the FDA, but there's no FDA regulation that can force them to wash their hands. And so what we're left with is, again, that analogy of the drunk looking in the wrong place. The FDA can prevent approximately 20% of foodborne illness cases at best.
Now, this is incredible what you're saying. Farmers in the farming process, from the beginning to the end of it, until their product leaves them and gets out into the pathway to consumers, farmers are generally not responsible for the vast majority of food safety issues. They take place in the transportation and the consumer delivery later on, and you could actually do far more to ensure our food safety by having people not cough on the produce and wash their hands and sanitize them before touching them. Is that right?
Yeah, no, if the FDA simply put out a guidance or gave every American $1 to buy a bottle of Purell, I think that we could, cut foodborne illness cases in half. And I'm guessing at that number. But when we talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act reducing foodborne illness cases by up to 3%, I think the impact of simply making sure people wash their hands is so much greater. And I think anyone in the public health community who's being the least bit honest would say the same.
So this is not only misguided government, it's also harmful. Now let's go back then to the issue that we put on hold for a little bit, and that is, now that we've established that this law is not necessary, and that even if it is implemented, it doesn't give us much benefit, it's not even targeted at what causes our food safety issues. Tell us what the harm is on small farmers. Give us some illustrations. I mean, how is this going to damage the ability of the average farmer to carry out his business or her business?
I'll tell you a story here just about a rule that the FDA attempted to push on small farmers and brewers, beer brewers, and how that would have destroyed both. Essentially, it would have driven up prices for milk and beer and food across the country. So there's something called spent grains, which basically are the grains that are used to brew beer. But once they've been used, they have no utility to man, except for the fact that cows really like to eat them. 8% of our nation's dairy cattle are fed with spent grains from America's breweries. And this is from the smallest brewery in America, that just brews a handful, a few kegs of beer, all the way up to Miller, Coors, and Budweiser, and these sort of giant breweries. Miller Coors donates, I think, or sells almost 100%, if not 100%, of their spent grains, gives them to dairy farmers and others. So this is a great, great way to reduce food waste, to keep prices low for farmers who want to feed their cattle, and it helps eliminate disposal costs for these breweries of all sizes. Well, the FDA proposed to ban this practice, or at least to regulate brewers as pet food makers, and they would be subject to rules as if they were in the business of making pet food under FSMA. And the Brewers Association, which represents America's craft brewers, and the Beer Institute, which represents larger brewers, were both up in arms. And America's small farmers also, many of which produce some of our great food, cheesemakers, people like that, were also completely baffled. They said they would literally go out of business because feed costs would be so expensive. So it's bizarre and crazy. And so they asked the FDA, they said, can you what is the public health issue that you're trying to combat here? Can you tell us? And they literally came out and said, and I'm not quoting, but I'm not, steering from the mission. They said, we can't cite one case of foodborne illness in an animal or in a person that's ever happened in the approximately 10,000 years that this practice of sharing spent grains has taken place.
Yet we're willing to spend over $1 billion on a federal law that will oppress small farmers. That's incredible. Baylen, let me ask you, if somebody is not a massive vertically integrated farming company, but the average farmer perhaps maybe making, say $50,000 in revenues, a small farmer, what are the costs of regulation just to comply with the FSMA?
I believe it's something for the smallest farmers, something around $6,000 a year, which pretty much is their profits if they're a very, very small farm.
That's a huge bite. That's
and
incredible.
I think the average farmer will be paying somewhere around $13,000 or $14,000, according to FDA estimates.
I don't see
costs.
I don't see how these farmers can stay in business with that kind of federal regulation. And we're just talking about compliance with one set of federal regulations.
Yes, of course.
Well, that is something. Now, let's go back to the issue we started with, and that is that after Congress has made a law and the president has signed it into law, we have agencies adding to it, proliferating the number of administrative rules and laws. And so one of the illustrative things that the FDA did is worth talking about, even though thankfully our colleagues defeated it, and that was to attempt to require that farmers of of crops such as watercress and so forth would have to use hothouses and cover the tops of those hothouse roofs so that birds flying overhead would not poop into them, because that could become a food safety issue. And so that would drive costs through the roof. Fortunately, that was defeated, I think, but give us a little insight into what's going on here with the power to create rules like this right and left.
Yeah, I mean, you're correct that these rules have been dialed back, but I would never say that they've been defeated.
Oh, okay. You're not as optimistic that it's dead and the coffin is nailed shut.
No, I'm pessimistic about everything. And at least when it comes to federal regulation of food. No, there's, so as with the spent grains issue, the FDA said, oh, we never meant that. Of course we wouldn't do that. But there's still, now they've asked brewers and farmers to offer them guidance and information about how is their practice safe.
And that's shifting the burden of proof. Instead of the FDA as the watchdog coming to them and saying, this is unsafe. In the entire history of mankind, we've seen how unsafe it is to have birds fly over farms. Instead of the government proving that before penalizing them, you're suggesting that they're asking farmers to prove that that practice is not unsafe. That's incredible.
No farmer is obligated to prove this, but they've invited farmers to offer their perspective, scientific data, things like this, on the safety of the
But
practice.
don't you think it shifts that burden somewhat? And the energies the farmers have to spend banding together, running a public relations campaign, doing research could be better spent growing food?
That is the primary job of the farmer, at least it used to be, until Washington came to every state.
Oh, that's something. You know, before we go, I want you to address something. We're picking up news reports that the FDA is kind of waffling on the application of the FSMA, the FSMA, to farmers. And I'm not sure the media has this all correct, but so I'm going to ask you as the expert. Is it true that, as some reports say, that the FDA is saying that the FSMA will not actually apply to farms?
I don't know that the FDA has said that,
Sure.
And I don't think that that would go with either the spirit of the law or of the rule, or certainly with the FDA's long-standing stance. They just went through this rulemaking process that took years, and I think that they've dialed back the idea that it would apply to the nation's smallest farms. There was a tester, Senator Tester, co-authored an amendment which exempted the smallest farms.
That's what it must be about.
And that there was a big fight over this because basically it was a semantic argument. The original intent of the law was that the FSMA would only apply to foods that are regulated under FSMA that are grown by farmers. And this is perhaps somewhat confusing, but the FDA decided that it would apply to everything sold by a farmer. So if you're a farmer and you sell $1 million worth of stuff, but only $10 of it is regulated by FSMA, you would be subject to these FSMA rules.
Well, Baylen, this has been very helpful, especially to us in Hawaii, so far away from Washington, D.C., yet impacted by the laws that federal agencies expand. Baylen, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network, and you can also watch us on thinktechhawaii.com. There are an incredible number of federal laws that impact every farmer in every state, including the Clean Water Act, which we're going to be talking about soon. And so do stay tuned as we keep you informed of what your government is doing. I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. Until we see each other next week, ehana kako. Let's work together to build a better economy, government, and society. Aloha.